Hi, this is the first lecture for the Psychological Foundations of Musical Behavior class. You should be accessing this lecture after you have done the reading quiz and done the reading, which is Chapter 1 and part of Chapter 2 in the textbook. So today we're going to talk about a couple of different things. First, we're going to talk a bit about the overview of what psychology of music is, and then we're going to we'll talk a little bit about psychoacoustics, which is very important because a lot of the studies and the work that we're going to read in the future really uses a lot of the terms that we're going to be distinguishing between today. So first, in chapter 1 of the book, it really kind of gives you an idea of what psychology of music is, kind of the vastness that is in it. And while it really touches on that, I want us to think about psychology of music as having three branches of it. You have a cognitive branch, you have a social branch, and you have a biological branch. So the cognitive perspective of psychology of music would ask questions that really look at how our brain is able to conceptualize and understand the stimuli that we hear. So questions that would arise out of the cognitive perspective of psychology of music are questions like, how do we construct music from sound perception? How is music encoded and represented in memory and imagination? How does musical thinking develop? How do experience and instruction shape musical thinking? Those could be some valid questions that would be asked from a cognitive perspective. Now, a social perspective would ask slightly different questions, and it really looks at the importance of social interaction or how music could affect social behavior. So questions from a social perspective would be things like, how does our social environment shape our perception of sound as music and our emotional or preferences or our preference responses to music? That was kind of a lengthy question. How does music influence our perception of our environment? For instance, music, especially in TV and movies, it highly influences your feelings towards characters or towards events that are going on within whatever you're watching. How do cultural and informal experience shape our musical understanding? So that would be, do you experience, well, we'll go on to that question a little bit later in the semester. And to what extent are cognitive processes like perception and memory enhanced or perturbed by environmental issues? Now, from the biological perspective, it's a much more scientific isn't the word that I want to use, but it's a little more hard science. It's a little more approaches it much more concretely. So it's looking at what parts of the brain are activated by certain musical experiences or stimuli. So questions from the biological perspective could be things like, what cortical systems are engaged by music, both real or imagined? So if I ask you to think about playing your instrument, what part of the brain is activated. Which one thing that's really interesting, a lot of research has shown that when we ask musicians to think about playing their instrument, the part of their motor cortex is activated. So like if a pianist thinks about playing the piano, the part of the brain that deals with finger function would be activated. And that happens with violinists and some other instrumentalists too. So other questions could be, to what extent are those systems used to process other kinds of information? A lot of research is, from this perspective, is looking at how music and language acquisition may be similar. And so the questions then there are, do they share space, or are they kind of concurrent processes? So if you learn music, that you kind of learn linguistic skills a little differently. Anyway, some other biological questions could be things like, are we hardwired for music processing from birth? Does music experience shape the development of distinct neurological connections? So, if children learn to play string instruments very early, do they kind of create networks in their brain that make them better listeners, or at least listeners to stringed instruments? Those are questions that are currently being pursued. Other questions: does music experience shape the development? Oh, I just said that. What is the nature of an emotional response to music? So, again, that kind of goes to looking at parts of the brain that hold emotion and how the activation of that through music, how that can be teased out. So we have these three different fields of psychology music. You have cognitive, which is kind of the interaction of the brain to the environment. You have social, which is essentially the music stimulus within the social environment. And then you have the biological, which is really looking at the brain itself and what activation is going inside of it. So there are different ways to kind of think of a paradigm of how these things would relate. You could see that the cognitive and the biological, they both deal with the brain, that they're kind of intertwined, and then the social psychology kind of encompasses all of it. Or you could see them that they're all three part of this big, field of social psychology. So within all three of these branches, we're going to hit on this semester a lot of different topics of that deal with the psychology of music, and those include evolution, neuroscience, the kind of the neurobiology of hearing and music perception. We're going to discuss pitch and time perception, music memory and expectation. We're going to talk about emotion and meaning in relation to music. We're going to talk about development as far as the development of musical skills or musical understanding, skill acquisition and performance of music, social applications of music within various contexts, such as how does playing fast music in a buffet make people want to get up and leave more, or does it make them want to be active and eat more food? We're going to look at kind of how different cultures experience music, what things are universal in music around the world and what things aren't. And we're finally going to end with music and medicine and how music can be used for therapeutic means. So that's kind of a big sketch of what this field of music, psychology and music really entails. So now I'm going to talk briefly about psychoacoustics, which psychoacoustics is the study of sensory responses to acoustic stimuli. How we respond, how we are able to understand these acoustic stimuli that happen within our environment. Another way to think about it is how physical disturbances are translated into conscious sensations. So what we're really talking about are essentially the elements of music as you have probably taught your students. However, when we approach it from a scientific approach, we don't really use the same terminology. And as we go through this, I'll be putting everything in correlation to something that you understand from music, so that you can see where the discussion from a scientific approach is, where they're embarking from. So the first kind of element of sound that we're going to talk about is pitch, which you probably know as being the highness or lowness of a tone. We use this really to represent where the pitch level is. It's interesting that when we talk about a pitch being high or low, this is really a cultural thing. In some other cultures, they call the tones either old or new tones, as opposed to high or low, or they might call them fast or slow tones. But in Western civilization, we have always referred to pitch as being the highness or lowness of a tone. Well, in the psychoacoustic world, instead of using pitch, which has a little bit of gray area because things kind of all fall around a certain pitch, and we'll talk about that in a second. We use the word frequency because the frequency is very precise. And a frequency is the rate at which a vibration completes a full cycle. Frequency is measured in hertz, which is abbreviated by a capital H and a Z, where 1 hertz is defined as a single cycle per second. Frequencies which are audible to the human ear, which is roughly between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, are often called the audio frequencies. So, we have like dog whistles that, we can't hear but dogs can hear, and that's because the frequency is higher than what we hear at 20,000 hertz. Also, as you get older, you lose that upper range of your hearing capacity. If you've seen those ringtones that only teenagers can hear but teachers can't hear, that's because the frequency is higher than what adult ears can hear. Here's a couple other terms that, so when we talk, you very well know that an octave is, essentially a pitch, the same pitch, but they are octaves apart. They are, it's one, if you go through the cycle of pitches, it'll be from one octave to the next. So they're the same pitch. And when we talk about psychoacoustics, we talk about pitch chroma, which it's essentially the same concept, that they're the same pitch. They're different frequency ratios, and it's normally 2 to 1. So, if you have a glass of water with so much water in it, and then you have about half that much water, those pitches should be about the same pitch. But so pitch chroma, it's the perceived similarity of pitches with a frequency ratio of 2 to 1. Now, when we're talking about frequency and pitch, we have these different tones, or the sound wave. These are examples of sine waves here. And you can see the different frequencies, like this is a faster frequency than this one because of, a full cycle is where it goes up to the trough and then back to the median. That's one full cycle. So there are a lot more full cycles on this than here. Here you see that the amplitude, the height of the wave is higher here than it is here. But these are all what we consider sine tones, which means they're perfect tones. There's no extraneous noise to them. And really, you can't experience sine tones in the natural world. The only way, we have made sine tones through technology. And so we're going to listen to an example of a sine tone now.
Listening example 3.1a.
So that was examples of a sine tone going through all of the pretty much the range, the typical range for human hearing. So in the natural world, we have more of what we call, well, all of the tones that we hear are actually complex tones, which this is on page 14 of your text. This is an example of a complex tone, and I wanted to kind of clarify a couple of words that some people use interchangeably, and I just want to make sure that it's clear that you understand the distinctions. So the thing about a complex tone is there are different waves that are combined to it to form the complex tone. So you have the fundamental, which is normally if you were asked to hum the pitch, that's the pitch that you would hum. So that's kind of the underlying foundation. That's the fundamental. And then you have overtones above it. And that's what kind of creates the sound to make it sound the way it is. Um, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later about how the wave, the frequency, and how the partials, how they affect timbre. So it's what the different waves in it are what make a trombone sound like a trombone versus what makes a violin sound like a violin. Now, these are the terms that I just really want to make sure you understand the distinctions between. So the fundamental is always the lowest wave, and then the ones above it are overtones. Now, when you talk about partials, a fundamental is a partial, as are the overtones are partials. So when you talk about partials, because all of these are a part of the complex tone. So some people think that overtones and partials are the same thing, but they're not. Overtones are what are above the fundamental, and then partials are any part of the complex tone. So the fundamental is technically a partial. And the way that and another thing that is a little bit confusing is how we label them. This is the fundamental, this is the first overtone, this is the second overtone. But we call them F1, F2, F3. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify those few things about that. So we're going to listen to a complex tone. And the thing about this, hold on one second. So we're going to listen to, complex tone. Here we go.
Listening example 3.1b.
Okay. Now, one thing that's interesting about how our human perception is that if that fundamental is gone, then we can still hear, but we only have the overtones, then we can still make out what the fundamental is supposed to sound like. Okay, so here is an example with this is a complex tone, however, without the fundamental.
Listening example 3.4a.
So the first one has the fundamental, the second one doesn't. But you can still tell what the fundamental is supposed to be. Okay. Now, as we're talking about pitch, just so that you know, but half steps are our smallest, pretty much within Western music, is kind of our smallest interval that we really use. I mean, yes, people bend and notes here and there, but as far as what we notate in Western music, really the smallest interval we use is a half steps. In the literature, you might see that half steps are often referred to as semitones. That's just a synonym. That's what the British or some of the Europeans use semitones as opposed to half step. Within psychoacoustics, we then further divide it even more precisely between two half steps. And so between any two, but in a half step, we have 100 cents. So CENTS, like money cents. And so there's 100 cents within a half step. So we're going to listen to, we're now going to listen to an example that really gets at what is called the just noticeable difference. And what the just noticeable difference is the smallest amount of change in a stimulus that can be detected at levels above chance. Well, what that means is that, like if you remember when you were a kid and you were doing your hearing test, they would say, okay, it's in the right ear or in the left ear, and you would do this or do that. And they keep doing it until they can tell that you're just kind of guessing. And so in science, what we do is we go further. We try to really identify where people are just doing things by chance versus when things are significantly more accurate. And so we're going to listen to an example of pitches that are 5 hertz apart. And you're going to tell at the lower end of the spectrum, or when you have slower frequencies, it's much easier to tell that the pitches are, that there is a pitch difference between them. But as we go up into the higher frequencies, it becomes more difficult. Let's see, I need to, here we go.
Listening example 3.2a.
So you can see that at the lower pitches, it was easier to hear than at the higher pitches. Another thing that happens when we're dealing with pitch that are very close together, only a few cents apart, there's this phenomenon called perceptual beating. And what that is a perceived variation in loudness produced by two near unison tones. You hear this kind of like, they call it beating because it kind of sounds like a fluttering almost. So let's hear an example of that.
Listening example 3.10.
So do you hear that? How the right when it starts, as the pitches are unison, and as they slowly change the frequency, you hear this kind of flutter or the beating sound.
Listening example 3.10.
Okay, I feel like you can hear this sometimes in choral singing. You can, I think maybe it's more apparent in kind of in horns than necessarily in string playing. But yeah, so those are kind of some of the some interesting phenomenon that happen with pitch. So now we're going to talk about timbre, which you know timbre to be it's the tone color or the tone quality. It's kind of this catch-all term that we use as musicians to kind of discuss what the sound sounds like, right? We know what a violin timbre is or a trumpet timbre, But it's not related to the pitch or the loudness. It's really about that unique quality of that makes that sound that sound. It's in the overall auditory identity or character of the sound. So that's how we talk about it as an element of music. But when we talk about it from a scientific standpoint, we talk about the complexity or the spectrum of the sound. And so the complexity is the specific shape or contour of a single cycle or a periodic sound function as represented by a two-dimensional graph. Okay, all that's to say, kind of going back to that complex. So you've got your full cycle. Like that would be what the complexity is. And so we're now going to listen to a couple of examples where, as I said before, all these different waves will help make the sound it's supposed to be. So if you took some of the waves away, it wouldn't really sound like, a trumpet. You need all of those overtone and partials to make it sound like what it sounds. And we're going to listen to that now. It's going to start, I think, with the fundamental, and as they layer it on, you're going to be able to identify what the instrument is.
Effect of spectrum on timbre. You will hear the sounds of two instruments built up by adding partials one at a time.
So obviously that was a gong. All right, I apologize. It wasn't a gong; it was chimes. And then the second one was a guitar. Now, when there are four temporal parts of the tone, in addition to that affect the timbre of a sound, and those are the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. And we call that whole that whole process, we call that the envelope of the tone. So what we're going to do now is we're going to see how the envelope affects the how the effective envelope affects timbre. So first we're going to listen to a little bit of a chorale just played normally.
Effect of tone envelope on timbre. You will hear a recording of a Bach chorale played on a piano.
Okay, so now they're going to play it backwards.
Now the same chorale will be played backwards.
And what I mean by that is they're actually reading the music backwards. They're not just playing the recording backwards.
Now the same chorale will be played backwards.
Okay, and so what they did then was they took that recording of playing it physically backwards, and then they played it backwards acoustically. So you're going to hear how the envelope, the decay, because on the piano you have a very firm attack, and then as long as you keep the finger down, the tone is sustained, but it will eventually decay, and then the release. So it's going to sound really bizarre, but it's the same as it should be the same as the first one we heard, but it shows how the decay affects affects the timbre.
Now the tape of the last recording is played backwards so that the chorale is heard forward again, but with an interesting difference.
All right. So the next element of music that you guys are all very well aware of is rhythm, but in psychoacoustics we really only talk about duration, which is the actual length in some sort of measured way. And rhythm, is kind of the pattern of durations in music, and for Western music, it's normally related. Those patterns are related to an underlying beat or metrical stress. We're now getting some music in here, so oh well. So there are some interactions between pitch and rhythm that are important as far as our perception goes. I'm first going to play this example where you'll see that the length of the length of the duration affects our understanding of the pitch. So this example has very short pitches, and so they don't even really sound like pitches necessarily. They might sound like clicks, but as they become longer, it's much easier to understand what the pitch content of it is.
Dependence of pitch salience on tone duration.
I'll be right back.
In this demonstration, 3 tones of increasing durations are presented. Notice the change from a click to a tone. Sequences are presented twice.
So in those examples, you kind of hear these clicks, and for me at least, it feels like as the pitches get longer, it's they almost change of where I think the pitch is. Um, so So yeah, let's look at, I think there's one more thing I wanted to, okay, yeah, and then there's this other phenomenon of between pitch and rhythm where it's easier for us to when we're going to skip that one. I don't think that's interesting. Well, so we have audio streaming, which is as pitches, distant pitches can stream faster can stream at faster tempi, meaning that we can kind of well, I'll play this example and we'll talk about it.
Demonstration 3. Loss of rhythmic information as a result of stream segregation. You will hear a cycle of 2 high tones and 1 low tone in a galloping pattern. Listen to what happens to the experience of the gallop as we speed up the sequence by shortening the tones. First, the tones are far apart in frequency. Next, the frequency separation is small.
So what goes on there is that when there is a difference in the pitch, or there's a bigger gap, um, that the pitch doesn't kind of get subsumed in the pattern, right? So when you listen to the slower, or the one with the wider gap between the pitches, that you can still kind of hear the independence of that lower pitch. But when it's brought right next to it, you can hear that galloping pattern. The galloping pattern kind of stays strong, but then feeling the independence of that pitch is kind of lost. All right, the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the difference between amplitude and loudness. So, when we're talking about dynamics, we normally talk about how loud or soft it is. In psychoacoustics, we're talking about the amplitude, which is the size of a wave vibrating at a given frequency. And we relate this intensity as measured in decibels, right? And one thing that you should know about decibels is that decibels is a logarithmic measurement. It's not a constant measurement. So that means that it's if something is in decibels is much higher, that means that logarithmically is much higher. While loudness is just a subjective understanding of how loud or how soft the sound intensity is. And loudness can be perceived on a lot of things, including frequency, timbre, amplitude, and duration. So today, like in this second part of the lecture, we really talked about kind of these elements of music and how they're looked at scientifically, and so that kind of deals with, and this is kind of janky, but we've got this. We have this way of looking at it. So the things that we consider, and this is what we would talk about as psychology of music, the frequency, the complexity, the duration, the amplitude. And those are kind of how they're related to each other. If you have any questions about the things that we talked about in this lecture, feel free to send me an email and let me know. All right, thanks for watching.